To understand why these heroes were forgotten, you first have to understand the world they were fighting to change. In 1775, the 13 American colonies were a pressure cooker. For decades, Britain had squeezed them, taxing their tea, quartering soldiers in their homes, dissolving their assemblies when they complained too loudly. The colonists weren't just angry, they were humiliated. And humiliated people eventually explode. When the first shots cracked at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, no one was truly ready. The Continental Army was not an army. It was a collection of farmers, tradesmen, and dock workers with muskets, facing the professional soldiers of the British Crown. What followed was 8 years of war. 8 years of disease, starvation, betrayal, brutal winters, and battlefield carnage. The odds were, by any rational calculation, impossible. And yet, they won. History has given the credit largely to the founding fathers, white, educated, landowning men whose faces now appear on currency and monuments. And they deserve credit, genuinely. Their leadership and vision mattered enormously. But leadership is only one piece of a war. Wars are won in the mud, in the dark, by people nobody thought to name. Let's name them now. The Continental Congress had a catastrophic problem by 1780. They had no money. The continental dollar had collapsed so badly that soldiers joked it took a wheelbarrow full of bills to buy a loaf of bread. France had agreed to support the American cause, but the loans were slow, the logistics were broken, and Washington's army was weeks away from dissolving entirely. Not from British bullets, but from bankruptcy. Enter Haim Salomon, a Polish-born Jewish immigrant who had arrived in New York in the early 1770s. Salomon was a financial broker, brilliant, multilingual, and deeply committed to the idea of American liberty. He had already been arrested twice by the British, the second time sentenced to death as a spy. He escaped, and then, extraordinarily, he got back to work, working alongside Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance. Salomon raised and personally guaranteed loans that kept the revolution financially alive. He brokered deals with French and Dutch bankers. He personally advanced funds, often without interest, often from his own pocket, to members of Congress who had run out of money to eat. James Madison, future president, wrote privately that he was almost ashamed of how dependent he was on Salomon's charity just to survive in Philadelphia. Historians estimate Salomon contributed the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in today's money to the American war effort. He died in 1785. Broke. The new nation never repaid him. His family petitioned Congress for reimbursement for decades. They were ignored. Today, there is a statue of him in Chicago, standing beside Washington and Morris. Most Americans have never heard his name. In 1781, the war in the South was at its most dangerous pivot point. British General Charles Cornwallis was moving through Virginia with devastating efficiency. He was brilliant, aggressive, and, crucially, he believed he knew the Americans' movements. He had spies, he had informants, he had intelligence networks feeding him information constantly. What he did not know was that his most trusted informant was actually working for the other side. James Armistead was an enslaved man from Virginia who approached the Marquis de Lafayette, the young French general fighting for the Americans, and volunteered to serve as a spy. Lafayette agreed, and what followed was one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the entire war. Armistead infiltrated the British camp. He posed as a runaway slave willing to work for the crown. Cornwallis trusted him completely, so completely that Armistead was eventually used to carry messages inside the British military itself. All of it went straight back to Lafayette. The intelligence Armistead gathered directly shaped the American and French strategy at Yorktown, the final, decisive siege of the Revolution. When Cornwallis surrendered in October 1781, effectively ending the war, a significant part of the credit belonged to a man whose name Cornwallis never once suspected. After the war, James Armistead returned to slavery. He was not freed. The law that granted freedom to enslaved men who served in the Continental Army applied only to those who had served in the army, not to spies. Armistead had served in the most dangerous role imaginable, and the new nation's law did not cover him. It took years of petitioning and the personal intervention of Lafayette himself, who visited America in 1784 and wrote a formal letter supporting Armistead's freedom, before the Virginia legislature finally granted him his liberty. He took Lafayette's name as his own, James Armistead Lafayette. He lived as a free man until 1830, a farmer, a veteran, a hero the country had almost discarded. You know Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. Now let me tell you about the one that covered twice the distance. Ridden by a 16-year-old girl, alone, in the dark, through a rainstorm on April 26, 1777. Her name was Sybil Ludington. Her father, Colonel Henry Ludington, commanded a regiment of the New York militia. On that April night, a messenger arrived at their farmhouse with devastating news. British forces under General William Tryon had landed at Danbury, Connecticut, and were burning Continental Army supplies, food, weapons, medicine that could not be replaced. The militia needed to be mustered. Now, tonight. Colonel Ludington couldn't go himself. He needed to stay and organize the men as they arrived. The messenger's horse was exhausted. There was no one else. Sybil volunteered. She rode 40 miles through Putnam County, New York, alone, at night in the rain, knocking on doors, calling men to arms, covering terrain that Paul Revere's famous ride didn't come close to matching in distance. Revere rode roughly 14 miles before he was captured by a British patrol. Sybil rode 40, and she made it home. By dawn, her father's regiment was assembled and marching. They arrived too late to save Danbury, but they engaged the British at the Battle of Ridgefield, forcing Tryon's forces to retreat to their ships. George Washington personally thanked Sybil Ludington for her service. And then history forgot about her for nearly 2 centuries. Her story wasn't widely published until 1907, over 130 years after the ride. Today, she has a statue in Carmel, New York, and a commemorative stamp. But ask any random American to name a midnight rider of the Revolution, and almost none will say her name. George Washington was a gifted commander, but Washington himself said openly that without Thaddeus Kosciuszko, the war would likely have been lost. Kosciuszko was a Polish military engineer, educated at the finest academies in Europe, who arrived in America in 1776 and immediately offered his skills to the Continental Army. What he found was an army that had no idea how to build defensive fortifications, no idea how to use terrain, and no real engineering capacity at all. He fixed that. At Saratoga in 1777, widely considered the turning point of the entire revolution, it was Kosciuszko who chose the ground. He surveyed the terrain, designed the fortifications on Bemis Heights, and positioned the American defenses with such precision that British General Burgoyne's superior force was funneled into a tactical trap they couldn't escape. Burgoyne surrendered. It was the first time a major British army had been defeated in the field, and it was the victory that convinced France to formally enter the war on America's side, the alliance that made ultimate victory possible. Kosciuszko went on to design and build the fortifications at West Point, which Washington considered the most strategically vital location in North America. After the war, Congress made him an American citizen, granted him land and a pension, and called him a hero. He gave the pension money to purchase the freedom of enslaved people, including, he specifically requested, those enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson never used the funds for that purpose. Kosciuszko returned to Europe and spent the rest of his life fighting for Polish independence. He died in 1817. In Poland, he is a national hero of the First Order. In America, he is almost completely unknown. By 1778, the British controlled New York City completely. Washington desperately needed intelligence from inside the city, troop movements, ship schedules, planned offensives. Without it, he was fighting blind. With it, he could anticipate, outmaneuver, and survive. He tasked Major Benjamin Tallmadge with building a spy network. What emerged was the Culper Ring, arguably the most sophisticated intelligence operation in American history up to that point. And at its heart was a woman named Anna Strong. Strong lived on Long Island, across the water from Connecticut, where the information needed to travel. She couldn't cross the Sound herself. It was too risky, too obvious. So she invented a system, her clothesline. When a courier named Caleb Brewster arrived to collect intelligence, Anna Strong would hang a black petticoat on her clothesline. The number of white handkerchiefs hung beside it indicated which cove Brewster was hiding in, giving the network a communication system that British patrols walked past every single day without understanding what they were seeing. The Culper Ring fed Washington critical intelligence for years. It exposed a planned British raid on French forces just after France entered the war. It uncovered the treason of Benedict Arnold, though just too late to catch him. It helped Washington execute convincing deceptions that kept British commanders guessing his true intentions. Anna Strong's role wasn't discovered by historians until deep into the 20th century. She left no memoir. She sought no recognition. She was a woman in an era that didn't record the work of women. She was also, by every measure, one of the most effective intelligence operatives the Revolution produced. Look closely at the famous painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware, by Emanuel Leutze. In the boat, pulling an oar, positioned just beside Washington himself, is a black man. His name, almost certainly, is Prince Whipple, an African man brought to America as a child and enslaved by William Whipple of New Hampshire. Prince Whipple served as William Whipple's personal attendant throughout the war. He was present at the crossing of the Delaware on December 25th, 1776, one of the most desperate and daring military operations in American history. He fought. He endured. He crossed that freezing river in the dark. After the war, William Whipple granted him his freedom, one of the relatively rare cases where an enslaved Revolutionary War veteran received liberty from the man who had enslaved him. Prince Whipple's story is representative of something historians have only recently begun to fully reckon with. Thousands of black Americans, both enslaved and free, served in the Continental Army and Navy, Some fought in exchange for promises of freedom. Some fought because they genuinely believed in the ideals the revolution proclaimed, even when those ideals explicitly excluded them. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment was one of the most effective fighting units in the Continental Army. It was largely black. It held the line at the Battle of Rhode Island against Hessian forces in 1778 with a discipline and ferocity that Washington's officers openly praised. These men fought for a country that, upon winning its independence, largely returned them to chains. Their sacrifice was real. Their erasure was deliberate. Closing. W.E.H.